Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another week of the Rec Poker Podcast, Forums Edition. I'm your host, Jim Reed, Jim in the Forums, and Bluffsterini in the Poker Stars home game. It's a pleasure to be here with this panel, starting with Chris Jones.
Yeah, I'm Chris Jones. I'm 5x5 on Poker Stars and Twitter.
And I'm John Somsky. I'm Poker Geek MN everywhere.
I'm Rob Washam, and I'm Rabman50 everywhere.
This is Taylor Moss. You can find me on Twitter at Taylor_Moss or in the Rec Poker home game as Gopherboy TJM.
And I'd like to thank Learn Pro Poker, website AMP, and Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino for their generosity in making this podcast possible. And I'd also like to thank our friend Jamel for coming back for one more week to talk poker with the panel. Jamel, tell the folks where they can find you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jim. I'm Jamel Cuevas. I'm Jamel on the forums and Fortune NY on the Rec.Poker home games.
And Jamel is rocking a really good-looking hat today. I got to tell everybody, boy, I hope you can find hats like that in the Rec.Poker shop because, boy, you're making that look good. You're making that look good, Jamel. So just like every week, we're going to talk about a post from the Rec Poker forums. And just like every week, we're playing in the home game, trying to take chips away from each other, trying to earn that elusive bronze pin. Tonight, we're talking about a hand or a post by our very own 5x5, Chris Jones. The name of it is ISO Jam Squeeze, Good or Reckless. Take us through it, Chris.
Yeah, so this came from a home game spot, and I think it's a spot that is kind of interesting. It's in we're at the 200-400 level, and Marbles Jam has a stack of 14K and opens to 800. I'm forgetting who this other player was, but they had a small stack of about 2,200. They were right next to Marbles Jam, so sort of an early position player with a short stack. Jammed for 2,200, and it folds around to me on the button. I have 11K in my stack, and I have Ace Jack offsuit. Before I tell you, I guess should I tell you what I did, or do we want to discuss what I should do?
Why don't you tell us what you were thinking about doing, and then we can talk about what the good option was.
In game, I elected to jam here. For 11K into a 14K stack, because the way I was thinking is that I really kind of hate the idea of calling here. I feel like I put an enormous amount of pressure on the Marbles Jam stack, and that the short stack is probably wider, much wider. They're getting short. They need to make a move. They're probably much wider than my ace jack. So I think I can isolate with my ace jack, potentially get better hands to fold, and go heads up against that stack while collecting some dead money. So that was my thinking in the spot. But what do you think? I guess my questions are, what do you think of the play? And then secondly, if you're in Marbles Jam's position, what's the weakest hand that you'd call with?
What do you think, panel? When I'm in this spot, I'm always stuck. An ace jack is such a good hand for this conversation because I agree with you, Chris. I don't think you can call there because you don't really get to define your opponent's ranges much at all. You're in a spot where you're going to have a hand that, if it flops top pair, it's probably good, but not always good. And if it doesn't, it's almost certainly worthless. So I like the idea of getting some fold equity here. And squeezes are a good place to exploit that, right? Like if you feel like you want to get some fold equity, find a squeeze spot, because it puts that extra pressure on both players. I could talk a bit about why you might choose ace jack or some other hands to do this with, but I'm interested in the rest of the panel's take on this spot. What do you think about the ranges of the other players? How would you play this? Give me a little feedback.
Honestly,
Go ahead, Taylor.
Okay. All right. I think ISO jams are very underutilized by a lot of recreational players, and they should be added to everyone's arsenal as soon as they can. Because if we just break this hand down and take all hand values out of this, We have someone who opened up to 800 chips, and then someone jam for a total of 2,200. So if we just think about this spot, if we have a hand that's good enough to want to call this 2,200, there's a lot of value in getting that other person to fold and fold their 800 chips and put that into the middle. Because if you accomplish that, so I'll try and use big blinds instead. So it was 2 big blinds and then a jam for just over 5. If you get that situation where you jam, the other person folds, and your heads up versus this other person for a 5 big blind all in, well, now there's a little bit extra in there because now there's an extra 2 big blinds. Just thinking about like normal situations, whenever there's an all in and a call, there's usually an extra 2 big blinds in there from the big blind and the antes. Now there's an extra 2 big blinds in there. It's just that much more incentivizing for you to want to play this hand. So like at a case level, that's kind of why we want to do this. Why we don't want to call in these spots is because it puts our hand so face up. Now we're in a spot where there's a lot of chips in the middle, and it's likely going to be a situation where the first person to act at it is going to win this hand. And when we're in those spots, we typically are only calling with what I like to call the shoulder ranges. You know, it's not the aces, it's not the kings, it's not the queens. It's more hands like jacks, tens, ace, jack, king, queen, eights, things of those lines that just don't generally flop all that well and flop in a way that makes you super confident to get it in. So if you can capitalize on some fold equity and get what should be a short stacks wide range heads up, like that's great. Like I want to be doing that all day long.
And particularly with a hand like ace jack, exactly, you're going to be dominating a lot of that short stacks range when they come over the top. They're going to be doing that with aces worse than jack, and they're the ones that you do want to line up. And just for some of our audience, a squeeze is anytime there's an open raise and then there's a call, and then you have an opportunity to make a re-raise on top of that. And one of the things that makes it effective is that the original raiser, they have to think about how is that next player going to call. They don't actually get to close the action. And so they have to release some hands that they would proceed with if they were closing the action. So you've already applied some fold equity in a very direct, easy to see way. And then the next player, the player who's really getting squeezed, they've already capped their range by calling in position instead of re-raising. And so in a way, they have already, you can eliminate some of the stronger hands from their range. Now, in this play, that doesn't quite apply because they've shoved a small stack, but there's just a different reason to get involved in the hand at this point, is because, as Chris is saying, they're getting anxious to double up. They're going to start taking some of those flips against the original raising range, and you can isolate them and get everybody else out of the hand when you do that. Another reason not to call in this particular spot is because that's going to incentivize that original raiser to call, and you do not want to be playing multi-way with ace jack. Even though you're effectively heads up from an action point of view after that, you're still going to have to show down your hand against that third hand at the end. And ace jack is just not a multi-way hand. It's a hand that benefits from playing heads up. So I'd say that it makes it an even better candidate to put it in a raise spot there.
Yeah, the sort of the effect of a short stack shoving in that spot isn't to cap their range, but it really widens their range, and I think that's what we're talking about here. Is like it sort of has the same sort of effect of a squeeze because we think that our ace jack is potentially ahead of their range. Not always, but ahead of like what their shoving range might be, and so. And the other thing that I like about ace jack versus say pocket eights or something like that is that we do have that blocker effect in terms of what we don't want to have happen here is to be called by marbles jam because we're really crushed by that calling range. But
once we make the shove, you mean once we make that over,
once we shove our 11K stack,
yeah.
It's not a good sign. I mean, we can possibly, we can be up against kings and queens and something and pull out our ace out of the hat, but we're in some trouble if we get called there. But but our ace is a nice blocker in that it reduces the number of combos of ace king, ace queen, aces that they have in their hand, even pocket jacks. So it's a nice hand to do this with.
Yeah, when I'm thinking about those hands to choose for this, whether it's a light 3-bet or a shove, um, the factors that I'm always thinking about, obviously there's just top-down value. Like, is it a value raise? Is it a value shove? It would be nice if you could always just do it with value hands, but we're going to advocate for widening that range up a little bit. And when you do, you've really you've got to weigh these two factors, the blocker effect and then the equity when called. And they kind of work hand in hand. There's some tension there because the hands that are good blockers, it's kind of another way of saying no kicker. So when they do continue, they're going to do it despite the fact that it wasn't very likely that they had an excellent hand. And the bad news is they have an excellent hand. So when they do have aces, ace jack's not a great holding to have there, but it's just less likely that they have it. When you're shoving, you don't get to, we talk about making light 3-bets with hands like suited connectors maybe, because you get to cover a lot of boards, so you can then make post-flop decisions surprisingly or to your advantage or more often. But when you're shoving, that is a tool that's not available to you. So blockers become kind of more important and playability becomes less important. So I think that, yeah, jump in there.
Well, so, and then, yeah, and on the opposite side of this, I really was kind of curious, if you're in Marbles Jam's position here and you're facing this action, what is the weakest hand you would call with?
So
Probably ace queen.
The original razor, and then you get the small raise, and then you shove.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe ace queen.
Ace queen.
Ace queen suited, maybe.
Mm-hmm. And what's the lowest pair you'd call with? Tens?
I said jacks.
Jacks?
Might do tens, but
Maybe tens.
Mm-hmm. So they're folding a lot.
Right.
They're folding a lot. Right?
And it comes to a point that I was going to bring up too before we moved on is what is their opening range too? Like we talk about like this spot and like this is great if it's, a middle position or late position open with a shove right behind it. Like, yeah, this is, just get those chips in with ace jack in this spot. But we do have the early position open, which I'm going to assume probably means under the gun or under the gun +1. And if we're playing 9-handed, that should be a pretty strong range, which makes the fold a little bit less likely. And we should be, kind of concerned about that. And it decentivizes you from going for this ISO jam. But when you're if they're in later position, yeah, if they've got hands that they're opening like king 10, king jack, queen jack, jack 10, sixes, fives, fours, all those types of hands that they're going to open and just, they're going to fold if you go for an ISO jam. Like this is just great for you to just jam in ace jack here and be happy about it.
So I've got a question. So one question is when we're talking about this blocker value, your ace is blocking a lot of the premium hands that you want them to have. The jack is kind of blocking some of those hands that you want them to be folding in this spot, right? It's a lot of those second best hands. Queen jack, king jack, jack 10 like we were talking about. I know it's not really that important, but can you guys talk a bit about why you might choose like ace jack instead of ace 7 here? Just from get the same blocker effect. Is it straight equity when called? Is that a reason why it's just not in your range? I see a lot of nodding heads.
I'd say yes. And I think this, if we start going, next level thinking with this type of thing, I think this is why a lot of charts that you'll see will have hands like ace 5 suited using this. Because one of the hands that they open here that we're actually targeting to get a fold is ace jack. And when we have ace jack ourselves, it makes it less likely for them to have that hand. Maybe they have ace 10 and that's something that you're targeting, but that's also a hand that you're currently beating and kind of want to get the chips in with. So it's kind of that weird situation of like you want them to have certain hands and fold certain hands, and if you really think about it, you don't really want to have a jack in this exact spot.
I think ace-7, ace-8 is like almost the worst of both worlds because you don't have straightening equity on being able to make a low straight, and 7 or 8 is not high enough to like beat most flops, right? At least with the jack, you can get a jack high board and be good.
Yeah.
With
Plus, in this
ace-7,
particular, sorry, go ahead.
well, I was just going to say with ace-7, your range is also weaker against the initial jammer. Because, assuming marble jams folds, you still have to beat the other player in order to take any chips down. So,
Yep, I think that's
Yeah,
a really key
very
point.
good point.
Really
Very good
key
point.
point here. Because heads up against their range, the difference between ace-7 and ace-jack is pretty big, actually. If they're in there with a bunch of those, 8s, 9s, 10s kind of hands. And they're going to be in there with ace-8, ace-9, ace-10 too. Like those are the kind of hands that we want to be ahead of when we've got ace-jack. And that matters a lot.
I think ace-7 is probably a fold
Right.
in Chris's spot. Ace-7 is a fold, ace-jack is a jam. And I don't know if ace-10 is a jam. I think ace-10 might even be a fold there.
So then what are some other good, I want to talk about this a little bit then. So what are some other good candidates there? If you're in a spot like this where you want to get some blocker value, you want to have decent equity when you're called, you don't want to always have a second best hand. It can't be just ace jack. What are some other hands or what are other types of hands that we might look at? Like why not king jack or, ace 10, as you say, or some other candidates like that? What do you think, guys? Or what are the factors that you're considering when you're deciding, is this that spot to take that shot?
I think there's a lot of good pairs that you could call with here, or do this move with.
The ISO shove.
Pocket 7s, I don't know about pocket 6s or not, because the odds are, well, never pocket 5s.
Yeah, you don't play that garbage.
Yeah. But I mean, the odds are that the shover likely has two big cards. They might be doing it with 10 jack or king queen or who knows what. And the pairs play pretty well against those. Now, there's also a possibility they might have an overpair to your pair, in which case you're crushed. But in general, I think that would work fairly well. And if marble jams calls, a pair will probably play fairly well against their range as well. So that would be my thought process.
So maybe we should look at this from the other side of the coin then. So what are the kind of hands that we would say absolutely you should not do this with? So we talked about maybe ace-7 because it kind of falls in that gap in between there. I think you probably wouldn't do it with like suited connectors, for instance, because you're not going to be ahead of the ISO jammer range. Yeah, what do you think, guys?
Yeah, hands like if you have queen jack suited here, it looks nice and you want to call because it's a 5 big blind all in. Generally speaking, you want to call 5 big blind all ins with a hand like queen jack suited. But at the same time, you have to worry about the other person that's in there. And you could just be donating a lot of your chips. So a hand like queen jack suited, which change some of the variables, take out the opening raise, you can make a case should call here. But the way it's played out, it's just an easy fold.
I mentioned ace-10 as a fold, but maybe ace-10 suited is a call. That's right on the cusp there. Because if we're calling with ace-jack, or if we're jamming with ace-jack off, I think we could also jam with ace-10 suited, but that would be the lowest ace that you could really do that with.
I'm doing that for sure. I'm definitely jamming with ace-10 suited here.
And there is something magical about ace-10, right? It's that last one that gets you Broadway on those few runouts. So there's something objectively better about ace-10 than ace-9 in a way that there just isn't about some of those other gradations in the hand rankings. So that's a good line to draw. And then is there something about like are there hands that, well, let's take this just a little further and then I'll let y'all go. So then what is it just a hand that's got a blocker and another high card that you're going to have good equity with in those spots is really feels like it's the blocker value that you're going for here. Looks like you,
Well,
Chris.
you've got to be looking at Marvel Jam's opening range from early position. And what we're saying is basically he's only going to be calling with a very, very small portion of that range. So you don't have to have the best of hands, but you still need to beat the guy that went all in. You still need to be ahead of him. So, and he didn't go all in as a first in. He went all in over an initial raise. So he can't be that weak. You know, it's not like he was the first one to go all in, so we could have ace four sitting there, you know.
That's a good point.
I got an ace, let's go. He has to worry about somebody's already in the hand, and then there's people to act after him. So,
yeah.
The non-blocker ones are the ones that John mentioned that I kind of, you know, that I could consider those sort of middle pairs. I think they've got, because I think they're going to play well against the shoving stack. And we're potentially going, because we said, you know, like maybe Jacks is the best one that we're playing here. I mean, I think we can get potentially some better, if we do this with sevens, we can get potentially some better hands to fold.
Yep, I like that. Really does change the dynamic of the hand when that ISO short stack is in there, because you're going to have to go to showdown, and right. And the stacks, yeah, it's different than a typical light 3-betting spot because you don't get to take advantage of any playability post flop too. So, yeah. All right. Well, any other thoughts before we close this one out, gang? Seeing none, I'd like to thank Running Aces, Hotel, Racetrack and Casino, Website Amp, Learn Pro Poker. Thanks Chris Jones, Jamel Cuevas, Taylor Moss, John Somsky, and Rob Washam. See everybody next week.